Hey, seventh graders, I'm Mrs. Painter, and today I will be teaching you Lesson 8, which is on writing proportions. And our central question today that we'll be answering is, how can you write a proportion that solves a problem in a real life situation? Maybe like a situation with pizza. So let's go ahead and do our first example. Example 1, writing a proportion. So a chef increases the amount of ingredients in a recipe to make a proportional recipe. The new recipe has 6 cups of black beans. Write a proportion that gives the number X of tomatoes in the new recipe. I also want you to notice that they've given us this table with original and new recipe at the top, and then black beans and tomatoes off to the side. And then at the bottom right corner, we've got the black bean soup recipe, which is the recipe that we're going to be modifying. And you can see its original ingredients include 1.5 cups of black beans, a half cup of salsa, 2 cups of water, 1 tomato, and 2 tablespoons of seasoning. So let's go back up to our question that says, a chef increases the amount of ingredients in a recipe to make a proportional recipe. This is something you'll do often if you're a cook. And it says the new recipe has 6 cups of black beans. So I would like to point out that the new recipe has 6 cups of black beans. So over here on our table, where we see the new recipe, we're going to put 6 cups of black beans. So for the black beans row, I'm going to put a 6 for the new recipe. Next, I see it says write a proportion that gives the number X of tomatoes in the new recipe. So when we look at this, it's telling us that X is going to be a number. So it's a variable that's holding the place of a number, and it's representing the number of tomatoes in the new recipe. So I'm going to insert that X down here. When we look at this table, I want to kind of point out proportions are a way for us to organize information or like data that's given to us so that we can make sense of it. And there's always more than one way to write a proportion. But I feel like using a table helps us set up a way for our brain to understand it really well. And eventually you'll get to a point where you don't need to write a table, but it's definitely a good place to start. So now we're comparing this new recipe, which has 6 cups of black beans, but we don't know how many tomatoes we'll need. And we want to compare it to the original recipe. So the original recipe values will need to be found in the original recipe. So that's down at the bottom. So in this specific scenario, we need to be looking at the black beans and the tomatoes. So let's pull those up from that recipe down below. I've gone ahead and highlighted our black beans, which is 1.5 cups. So I'm going to bring that up to my table. And then I've also highlighted 1 tomato. So our original recipe required us to have 1 tomato. So now we've got our table set up, and we can move on to the next step, which is writing that proportion. And all we'll have to do is take that table and pretty much set them equal to each other. And that's how we write the proportion. So we'll take the original recipe, which was 1.5 cups, and I'm just going to call it black beans, BB, over 1 tomato is equivalent or equals 6 cups of black beans for how many tomatoes? And that's one of the proportions that we could write, and that's the exact proportion that we would write for this scenario. So let's move on and try a couple more. For this first on your own, I want you to write a proportion that gives the amount of Y of water in the new recipe compared to the original recipe. So I want you to use the question from before, and I want you to kind of use it as a guide and see if you can come up with a proportion that gives the amount of water described as Y in the new recipe compared to the original.